Thank you for being with us on France 24. It's now time for business, and Catherine Bennett joins me here in the studio. Catherine, it's great to have you on. You're reporting on actually one of the stories that we've been talking about throughout the day. China's just reported its GDP figures for 2020, and we can really see that the economy's made this rather impressive rebound despite the pandemic.
Yes, that's absolutely right, Sanam. So this is quite an impressive feat considering the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's impressive both in the scale of its recovery and in the speed of that recovery as well. So China is the only major economy in the world that has managed to avoid a contraction in 2020. Gross domestic product grew 2.3% last year, and that trend is set to continue. GDP should expand at its fastest pace in a decade this year. The coronavirus outbreak effectively brought China to a standstill in the first quarter of 2020, and you can see that reflected in the figures. The economy contracted by 6.8%, but it had already managed to return to growth by the second quarter, and by the final quarter of the year was up 6.5%. Now, earlier we spoke to our China correspondent, Charles Pellegrin, who explained how the country got back to growth.
First and foremost, what's behind this is China's decisive response to the COVID-19 pandemic on its own territory that's allowed work to resume and allowed supply chains to basically pick up where they left off. We've seen a V-shaped recovery. During the first quarter of 2020, the economy went down 6.8%, and then at the end of 2020 Q4, it went up 6.5%. And this was basically because China closed its borders and then did everything it could to stomp on any local transmission of the virus. After that, the export sector in China benefited. China is a huge producer of medical equipment and medical goods, so we've seen Chinese-made masks being exported around the world as well as other equipment. And in general, Chinese exporters have managed to gain market share on their foreign competitors, who often are still dealing with virus restrictions around the world. So really, China looking like it's coming out of this pandemic strengthened China's economy, as opposed to the rest of the world's economy that still appears to be quite weakened.
Samsung's de facto head, Lee Jae-yong, has been sentenced to 2.5 years in prison over corruption. Lee has already served 1 year of a prison sentence, but was freed after a ruling from an appeals court. His return to detention in South Korea is a reminder of the historically close relationship between the country's business leaders and political elite. Cole Stangler has more.
On board this bus, Lee Jae-yong arrives at a prison on the outskirts of Seoul. A dramatic change in scenery for the de facto head of Samsung. It followed a court ruling that found Lee, who assumed leadership of the firm from his ailing father in 2014, paid around 6.5 million euros in bribes to the former president of South Korea, now in jail herself for corruption. Lee's lawyer disputes the ruling.
이 사건은 본질이 전 대통령의 직권남용으로 기업이 자유와 재산권을 침해당한 것입니다. 그러한 본질을 우리가 고려해 볼 때 재판부의 판단은 유감이라고 생각합니다.
Either way, the case shines a light on the close relationship between Korea's political elites and its family-led corporate conglomerates known as the Chaebol. Samsung is the largest and makes up a staggering fifth of the country's GDP. In the past, Korean presidents have pardoned Chaebol bosses charged with wrongdoing, like Lee's father, Lee Kun-hee, who was found guilty and pardoned twice over white-collar crimes, including paying bribes. South Korea's current president, the liberal Moon Jae-in, has vowed to rein in the power of the family-run conglomerates, and his party has proposed legislation that would reduce the influence of large shareholders. As it grapples with the heightened scrutiny, Samsung will now face a leadership vacuum. While analysts say day-to-day operations likely won't be affected by Lee's departure, his absence may well prove to have an impact on the company's long-term strategy.
And we can take a look at the markets now and how they're reacting to that news from Asia. Europe's stocks slow out of the gate this morning and still lackluster later in trading. The FTSE and the CAC 40 are down 1/3%, and Germany's DAX is sitting on the flat line. Over in Asia, Chinese stocks rose earlier on the news of China's economic data, with the Shanghai Composite and the Hang Seng Index up by 1%. Stocks in Seoul plunged on the news of Lee's conviction. The Kospi Index led losses in the region, declining by 2 1/3%. In Japan, the Nikkei also down by 1%. A group of London business leaders have written to the UK government urging it to step in to save the rail firm Eurostar. The service, which links mainland Europe with the United Kingdom, has seen a 95% drop in passenger numbers since the start of the pandemic. Unlike other travel companies, it hasn't been eligible for government financial support. A Eurostar spokesman said that without additional funding, the company's survival is at risk.
More turbulence for a sector that's seen its fair share over the last year. As of Monday, all visitors flying into the UK need to show a negative COVID test 72 hours before departure. A policy designed for health reasons, but according to an airport lobby group, one that'll make, quote, a devastating situation worse for airports facing some very difficult months ahead.
Airports are running on empty. There's only so long they can run on fumes before having to close temporarily to preserve their business for the future. Government needs to help cover airports' operational costs.
British airports have already received state aid, benefiting from deductions on last year's property taxes, but those write-offs were capped at £8 million each, leaving the bigger international hubs like London's Heathrow on the hook for much of the bills they would pay ordinarily. Last year, Britain's largest airport saw passenger traffic slump some 73%. The challenges aren't limited to the UK. According to Europe's airport lobby, some 6,000 routes have been scrapped since the onset of the health crisis, a figure that accounts for a roughly 50% drop in total routes offered. Amid the uncertainty, Heathrow has proposed hiking landing fees it charges airlines, but they too are facing heavy losses from the drop in travel.
That wraps up the business from me.
Thank you very much for that business update, Catherine. Thank you for being with us. Do stay tuned. More news coming out from me and the team in just under 5 minutes' time.